Sir, we do not allow pets in this hotel.
He is a certified service animal.
Nobody behind that front desk had any idea, as they told a tired man in a faded ball cap that his dog wasn't welcome, that the name on the deed to the building around them, buried 3 layers deep in a holding company nobody at that front desk had ever heard of, was his. What they saw was a stranger who looked like he'd slept in his truck. What they didn't know, and wouldn't know for another 11 hours, was that they'd just insulted the man who signed their paychecks. Colton Reyes was 52 years old, and if you passed him on the street that October evening, faded jeans, a canvas jacket gone soft at the elbows, 3 days of gray stubble, a limp he'd carried since a rooftop in Ramadi in 2006, you would have guessed retired mechanic before you guessed hotel magnate, and that was exactly how he preferred it. He'd built Meridian Point Hospitality from nothing over the better part of 2 decades, starting with a single rundown motor lodge outside Amarillo that he'd bought at auction with money saved from 4 years in the Army, and a small settlement from the injury that ended his service, and had grown it, property by property, market by market, into a chain of nearly 200 hotels spread across 11 states. Mid-market properties built on a simple promise he'd written into the company's founding documents himself: clean rooms, honest pricing, and a standing policy, non-negotiable, that any veteran, active-duty service member, or person with a documented service animal would never, under any circumstances, be turned away or charged an unauthorized fee. He'd written that policy the year the company incorporated, back when Meridian Point was 3 properties and a payroll he sometimes couldn't fully make on time, because he remembered with a clarity that had never dulled what it had felt like to be a young soldier back from his first deployment, exhausted and hollowed out in ways he didn't have words for yet, standing at a check-in counter somewhere in Oklahoma being told the hotel didn't allow dogs, no exceptions, while the animal beside him. A scarred, steady-eyed Belgian Malinois named Cass, who'd walked point beside him through more compounds than Colton could accurately count, stood there patient and confused, having done nothing wrong except exist in a body that made a clerk uncomfortable. That memory had never left him. It had, in fact, become the entire architecture of the company he'd spent the rest of his working life building, brick by brick, market by market, specifically so that no soldier and no service animal would ever again stand at a counter like that one and be told they weren't welcome. The road from that Oklahoma parking lot to a 200-property hospitality chain hadn't been a straight one, and Colton didn't tell the story of it often, not because he was ashamed of any part of it, but because the telling always seemed to flatten something that had, in the actual living of it, felt anything but simple. He'd mustered out of the Army with a shattered ankle that never healed quite right, a modest disability rating, and $11,000 in savings that most financial advisors would have told him to put toward a mortgage or a retirement account, not toward a decrepit 32-room motor lodge on the outskirts of Amarillo with a leaking roof and a reputation, among the handful of truckers who still stopped there, for mattresses that had seen better decades. He'd bought it anyway at auction, for less than the price of a used car, and had spent the better part of a year rebuilding it with his own hands, learning plumbing from library books, learning electrical work from a retired contractor 2 exits down who took pity on him and taught him for the price of dinner a few nights a week, learning, above everything else, the particular discipline of doing a job right the first time because he couldn't afford to do it twice. Cass had been with him through nearly all of that first year, curled in the corner of whichever room Colton happened to be gutting that week, and it was during that stretch hammering drywall alone in an empty building at 2 in the morning, because sleep still didn't come easy for him back then either, that Colton had first written out, longhand, on a yellow legal pad he still kept in a drawer in his office decades later, the handful of principles he wanted the eventual business to stand for. Most of them were ordinary enough: clean rooms, fair pricing, treat every employee like they mattered because they did. But the veteran and service animal policy had its own separate page, underlined twice because even in that first exhausted year, broke and uncertain whether the motor lodge would survive its first winter, Colton had known with total clarity that this particular promise was not negotiable, not now, not ever, not even if honoring it cost the company money it could barely spare. Cass had passed at 13, peacefully, in the office of the 3rd property Colton ever opened, curled on a dog bed beside his desk on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, and Colton had closed that property for the rest of the day, an indulgence he'd never once regretted despite what it cost him in lost bookings, and had buried her himself on a small plot of land behind that same building, a spot that Meridian Point's corporate landscaping crew still maintained, unprompted to this day. Though most of the current staff had no idea whose grave they were tending or why the founder had specifically instructed, in writing, that the plot never be disturbed by any future renovation. Diesel had come into his life 6 years after Cass's passing, adopted through a military working dog retirement program that placed animals with former handlers and veterans specifically. And though Colton hadn't served as a K-9 handler himself during his own enlistment, the program had made an exception for him, given his documented history with Cass and the extensive, verified accommodations his company had built specifically around service animals. A small irony that Colton appreciated more than he let on, that the very policy he'd created to help other veterans had, in its own roundabout way, helped qualify him for a dog of his own when he needed one most. The retraining that followed, converting Diesel from a retired military working dog into a certified medical alert service animal, had taken the better part of 8 months, working with a trainer named Odell Bishop who specialized in exactly that kind of transition, and Colton had driven out to Odell's facility 3 times a week for the entire stretch, not because it was required of him, but because he'd wanted badly. To be present for every stage of building trust with this particular animal, the way he understood, from years of watching working relationships between handlers and dogs, that trust wasn't something you could simply inherit alongside a leash and a certification. It had to be built, deliberately, session by session, the same patient way he'd once rebuilt a leaking roof board by board. By the time Diesel's training concluded, the two of them had developed a shorthand that went well beyond the formal alert behaviors. A particular way Diesel would press his full weight against Colton's leg when a room felt crowded in a way that made Colton's chest tighten with old, half-buried anxiety. A habit of resting his chin on the edge of the bed each morning until Colton acknowledged him. A small daily ritual that had become, over 9 years, as fixed a part of Colton's routine as coffee. He traveled incognito more often than his board of directors entirely approved of, a habit he'd started in the company's early years out of necessity. You couldn't afford a big staff of quality inspectors when you were 3 properties deep, so Colton had simply driven the routes himself, checked into his own hotels under a false name, and evaluated the experience the way a real guest would, noting every small failure, every rude interaction. Every corner cut by a manager trying to hit a quarterly number. He'd never fully given up the habit, even after the company grew large enough that he could have hired an army of professional secret shoppers to do the work for him. There was something about doing it himself. He'd tell his board when they raised eyebrows about the CEO of a 200-property chain personally checking into his own budget locations under an alias. That kept him honest, kept him connected to the actual guest experience instead of the sanitized version that made it into quarterly reports. That particular October, he was 3 weeks into a routine he ran maybe twice a year, driving a loose circuit through a cluster of properties in the southeast, checking in unannounced, evaluating everything from the firmness of the mattresses to the friendliness of the overnight staff, sleeping in a different Meridian Point property most nights, sometimes 2 nights running if something felt worth a closer look. He drove his own truck for these trips, an aging F-150 that had long since stopped being fashionable war clothes that gave away nothing about his actual net worth, and traveled, as he always did on these trips, and as he had for the better part of 15 years with Diesel. Diesel was 11 years old that fall, a German shepherd with a chest gone slightly gray and a gait that had grown stiffer with age but hadn't lost a fraction of its dignity. And he was, officially and legally, a certified service animal, trained originally as a military working dog before Colton adopted him out of a retirement program 9 years earlier, and retrained since then, through months of patient, deliberate work. To alert Colton to the early physical warning signs of the seizure disorder that had developed in the years following his own combat injury, a condition most people who met Colton never knew he carried, because Diesel's alerts, when they came, gave Colton just enough warning to sit down, find a wall, remove himself from danger, before anything visible happened at all. The dog had a paperwork trail as thick as a phone book, a service animal certification from a nationally accredited training program, a laminated ID card Colton kept in his wallet, veterinary records current and complete, and a harness, worn every single time they traveled together, embroidered plainly with the words service animal, do not pet, letters large enough to read from 10 feet away. There was, in other words, no reasonable universe in which any hotel employee with basic training could look at Diesel and mistake him for an unauthorized pet. Which was exactly what made the evening of October the 14th, at the Meridian Point property just off the interstate outside a town called Barrow Falls, so specifically infuriating. Colton pulled into the lot a little after 7 that evening, tired from 6 hours on the road, his bad leg aching the particular deep ache it got after too long behind a wheel. Diesel stretched across the truck's back seat in the loose, boneless way older dogs sleep when they trust the vehicle they're riding in. He clipped the service harness on before he got out of habit as much as necessity, and walked into the lobby with Diesel heeled neatly at his left side, the two of them moving with the easy, practiced coordination of a partnership over 9 years deep. The lobby was unremarkable in the way Colton had specifically designed Meridian Point lobbies to be unremarkable: clean, well-lit, a small seating area near a gas fireplace that wasn't lit that evening, a front desk staffed by a young woman whose name tag read Brittany, and who was, when Colton approached, deep in a conversation on her cell phone that she didn't immediately end. He waited patient, the way he'd learned to be patient about small discourtesies over a lifetime of experiences that had taught him bigger battles were worth saving his energy for. Diesel sat at his side without command, the way he always did at a counter, watching the room with the calm, steady attentiveness that 9 years of partnership had built into him. Brittany finished her call after another 30 seconds or so, set the phone down without any particular apology, and looked up at Colton with an expression that shifted, almost immediately, from the neutral politeness of greeting a new guest to something more guarded the moment her eyes landed on Diesel. "Checking in?" she asked, though her tone suggested the question was more formality than genuine inquiry. "Reservation under Reyes," Colton said, giving the name he used on these trips, his own legal name, in fact, since he'd never seen a reason to travel under a false identity when the anonymity came simply from nobody at these properties knowing what their own CEO looked like. One night, possibly two. Brittany typed at her keyboard, found the reservation, and then her eyes went back to Diesel, lingering there with an expression Colton had seen before, more times than he liked, over the years, the particular blend of suspicion and irritation some people carried toward any dog, regardless of training or certification, simply because a dog represented to them mess and liability and inconvenience. "I'm going to need to see documentation for the animal," she said. "We don't allow pets at this property." "He's a service animal," Colton said, keeping his voice even unhurried, the tone he'd used 1,000 times over the years in exactly this kind of moment. A tone built for de-escalation rather than confrontation, though something in his chest had already begun tightening in a way that had nothing to do with irritation at Brittany specifically, and everything to do with the particular, familiar dread of watching a policy he'd written with his own hands, for exactly this reason. Fail to function the way it was supposed to. I've got his certification and ID right here. He reached for his wallet, unhurried, and produced the laminated card, along with a folded printout of Diesel's most recent veterinary and training documentation that he carried out of long habit, specifically for moments like this one, though moments like this one had grown rare enough over the years that some part of him had allowed himself to believe the company's training had finally caught everywhere it needed to. Brittany glanced at the documentation with an expression that suggested she wasn't reading it so much as performing the motion of reading it, and then shook her head. "I understand you have paperwork," she said, "but our hotel policy doesn't allow dogs, service animal or not. Corporate's pretty strict about it. We had an incident a while back, damage to a room, and management put a blanket no pets policy in place after that. I can call you a cab to a pet-friendly property if you want. There's one about 15 minutes up the highway." Colton stood very still for a moment, processing what he just heard, running it against everything he knew to be true about the company's actual, written, non-negotiable policy. A policy that existed specifically, explicitly, in writing, in every employee handbook, in every training module every single front desk employee at every Meridian Point property was required to complete before their first shift, precisely to prevent this exact scenario from ever happening. "That policy doesn't exist," he said, keeping his voice level, keeping the tightness in his chest from bleeding into his tone. "Meridian Point's corporate policy is explicit. Service animals are welcome at every property, no exceptions, no additional fees. I'd like to speak with your manager, please." Something flickered across Brittany's face, not quite doubt, but something adjacent to it, the small hesitation of an employee who suspects, briefly, that she might be standing on ground less solid than she'd assumed, before it hardened back into the same defensive posture. "Manager's not on shift right now. I'm the senior staff member here tonight. And look, I don't make the rules, sir. I just enforce what I've been told. If you want to file a complaint, there's a number on the website." "There's a number I can call," Colton said, and something in the flat, precise way he said it made Brittany's eyes narrow slightly, though she still had no way of understanding why a tired-looking man in a faded jacket would speak with quite that particular certainty about a corporate complaint hotline. "But I'd like to try the manager first. Do you have a name and a number for whoever runs this property?" Brittany hesitated, then reached under the counter and produced a business card, sliding it across without much grace. "General Manager's Doyle Krantz. That's his cell on there, but he doesn't love being called after hours over stuff like this." Colton took the card, glanced at it, and felt the tightening in his chest settle into something colder, something with more edges to it, because the name Doyle Krantz meant something to him, sitting somewhere in the back of his mind attached to a file he vaguely recalled from a quarterly regional performance review, a file that had crossed his desk months earlier flagged, mildly, for an unusually high rate of guest complaints relative to comparable properties in the region. Complaints his regional operations director had characterized, at the time, as likely just a run of bad luck with a few difficult guests. "All right," Colton said, "I'll call him myself." He stepped a few feet away from the counter, Diesel moving with him in the same easy heel, and dialed the number on the card, watching Brittany's expression shift toward open discomfort as she realized this particular guest wasn't simply going to accept the cab offer and leave quietly. Doyle Krantz picked up on the fifth ring, his voice carrying the particular irritation of a man who'd been interrupted during his evening and intended to make the interruption as brief as possible. "This is Doyle." "Mr. Krantz, my name is Colton Reyes. I'm at your front desk right now, and your staff has just informed me that Meridian Point maintains a no-pets policy that prevents me from checking in with my certified service animal. I'd like to understand where that policy came from, because it directly contradicts written corporate policy." There was a pause on the line, and when Krantz spoke again, his voice had shifted, become more careful though not, Colton noted, in the direction of genuine concern. "Look, I don't know what corporate document you're reading, but I run a tight property here, and dogs create liability I'm not interested in carrying allergies, damage, other guests complaining. I put that policy in place myself a while back and it's worked fine. If you've got a problem with it, you're welcome to find another hotel. There's a Hampton up the road." "You're telling me," Colton said, his voice still level, still even, though something in the precision of it had taken on an edge that would have concerned anyone who knew him well enough to recognize the shift, "that you unilaterally overrode a written corporate policy, one that specifically protects veterans and service animals, a policy I can promise you exists in writing in the employee handbook every staff member at this property signed off on completing. Because you personally decided you didn't want to deal with dogs. I don't know who you are or why you're quoting me corporate policy like you wrote it yourself," Krantz said, an edge of genuine irritation creeping into his voice now, "but I've been running this property for 6 years and I know what works. You want to file a complaint, file a complaint. I've had guests threaten that before. Doesn't change anything on my end." "I understand," Colton said. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Krantz." He ended the call and stood there for a long moment in the lobby, one hand resting lightly on Diesel's head, feeling the G lean into the touch with the same steady patience he'd shown through the entire exchange, unbothered by the tension in the room in the specific way years of training had built into him, alert to genuine danger, entirely unfazed by ordinary human friction. "You heard all that," Colton said quietly, mostly to himself, though Diesel's ears turned toward the sound of his voice. "Man just told the owner of his own company to go find a Hampton." He didn't say it loud enough for Brittany to hear, and he didn't, in that moment, correct the record for her either. Some old, patient part of him, the same part that had spent 2 decades building a company slowly, deliberately, brick by brick, rather than through shortcuts or public confrontation, wanted to see the rest of this play out honestly first, wanted to understand the actual shape of the problem before he revealed who he was and potentially short-circuited the chance to see it clearly. "I'm not able to check in tonight, then," he said to Brittany, keeping his tone even, giving away nothing. "I'll figure something else out." He walked back out to his truck with Diesel at his side, the October air sharp and cold against his face, and sat for a long moment behind the wheel before starting the engine, turning the entire exchange over in his mind with the same methodical attention he'd once applied to assessing a compound before a breach, not reacting yet, just gathering information, understanding the full shape of the problem before deciding how to address it. He drove 11 minutes up the highway to a truck stop diner he remembered from an earlier trip through this same corridor, parked, and sat there with Diesel's head resting on the center console, working through his phone with the particular focus of a man who'd learned, over 2 decades of building something from nothing, that the right first move in a crisis was almost never the loudest one. He called his head of human resources first, a woman named Priya Desmukh who'd been with the company for 12 years, and who Colton trusted with the kind of unqualified confidence he extended to almost nobody else in the organization, and laid out what had happened plainly, without editorializing. "That's a direct violation," Priya said immediately, her voice sharpening with the particular alertness of someone who took the company's veteran and service animal policy as personally as Colton did, having helped him write the original language into the handbook years earlier. "Colton, that's not just bad customer service. That's potentially an ADA violation depending on how it's documented, and if he's applying it as a blanket policy rather than a one-off bad judgment call, that's a pattern that could expose the company to real liability." "That's what I want to understand," Colton said. "I want you to pull everything you've got on that property, guest complaint history, any prior incidents involving service animals or veterans specifically, staff training completion records, everything. I want it by morning if you can manage it." "I'll have it tonight," Priya said. "Colton, are you all right? You sound—" She paused, searching for the word. "I'm fine," he said, and meant it mostly, though something about standing in that lobby, hearing a general manager tell the founder of the company, though the man had no way of knowing it, to go find a Hampton, had lodged itself somewhere behind his sternum in a way that felt disproportionate to a single bad customer service interaction, and he suspected, sitting there in the diner parking lot with Diesel's warm weight against his leg, that the disproportion had less to do with tonight specifically, and more to do with the memory it had dragged back up, unbidden, of a much younger version of himself standing at a different counter, in a different state, 20-some years earlier, being told exactly the same thing by exactly the same kind of dismissive certainty. "Get some rest," he told Diesel, more than he told himself, reaching down to rub behind the dog's ears, feeling the animal lean into the touch with the same steady trust he'd offered through the entire ordeal. "You did everything right tonight. Wasn't you that failed? Wasn't even really that girl at the desk, not fully. Something bigger's broke here, and we're gonna find out how deep it goes." He checked into the truck stop's attached motel that night, a modest, independent property with a manager who took one look at Diesel's harness, nodded without a word, and handed over a key without a second thought, the kind of unremarkable, correct response that made Colton's chest ache with something like grief for how rare that basic decency had become at his own properties, evidently without his knowledge. He didn't sleep well that night, not because of any physical discomfort, but because his mind kept circling back through the exchange, through Krantz's flat certainty that a blanket no-pets policy was simply how he chose to run things, through the particular detail that stuck sharpest. Krantz had said he'd been running the property that way for 6 years. 6 years. Not a single bad night's impulsive decision, but a standing practice, sustained across 72 months of quarterly reviews and regional inspections that Colton's own company structure was supposed to catch and correct. Around midnight, unable to settle, he sat up in the motel room's single chair with the lamp on low, Diesel lifting his head briefly from the foot of the bed to check on him before settling back down, and Colton found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, pulling up on his phone the old scanned copy of that original yellow legal pad, the one with the founding principles written out longhand in his own younger, less steady handwriting. A document he kept digitized specifically so he could carry it with him on trips like this one. He read back through the veteran and service animal page, the words underlined twice just the way he remembered writing them, sitting alone in a half-gutted motor lodge with Cass curled beside him and $11,000 standing between him and total failure, and felt the old conviction settle back into him, steady and unshaken despite everything that had gone wrong at one property under one man's unchecked authority. "Wasn't the policy that failed," he murmured to Diesel, who had lifted his head again at the sound of his voice. "Policy was always right. It was the checking, Nobody checked close enough, long enough, to catch a man deciding he was bigger than what we built this whole thing to protect. He set the phone down eventually, turned off the lamp, and lay awake a while longer in the dark, listening to Diesel's steady breathing from the foot of the bed, and found, somewhere in that quiet stretch before sleep finally came, that the anger from earlier that evening had settled into something more useful, not less serious, but more focused. The particular calm clarity he recognized from years of turning outrage into a plan rather than letting it simply burn itself out unproductively. By 6 the next morning, Priya's email had arrived, and Colton read through it sitting at the small motel room's single table, coffee going cold beside him, Diesel stretched across the floor in a patch of early light coming through the window, and the shape of what he read there confirmed the cold, precise dread that had settled into him the night before. The Barrow Falls property, under Doyle Krantz's 6-year management tenure, showed a pattern of guest complaints markedly higher than comparable Meridian Point locations in the region, not simply higher in raw number, but disproportionately concentrated in a specific category that Priya had flagged with a note of her own. Complaints from guests identifying themselves as veterans, or guests traveling with documented service animals, alleging they'd been denied rooms, charged unauthorized pet fees, or treated with open hostility by front desk staff. 7 such complaints over the preceding 18 months alone, each one logged in the corporate complaint system. Each one, according to the resolution notes attached to the file, closed out with a boilerplate apology email and no substantive follow-up investigation into the property itself. 7 complaints in 18 months, Colton read aloud, quiet mostly to Diesel, though the dog's ears turned toward the sound of his voice anyway. 7, and every single one just got a form letter and got filed away. He kept reading, and the picture that emerged over the following pages of Priya's summary was worse than a single bad manager exercising poor judgment. Staff training completion records for the Barrow Falls property showed a completion rate for the mandatory service animal and veteran accommodation modules sitting at just under 40%, meaning more than half of Krantz's staff had never actually completed the training that would have told them, in plain language, exactly what Brittany had failed to tell Colton the night before. That turning away a certified service animal wasn't a matter of local manager discretion. It was a hard, non-negotiable company policy with legal weight behind it. Financial records Priya had pulled, cross-referencing the property's expense reports against corporate training compliance software logs, suggested something even more deliberate than simple neglect. The property showed a pattern of staff turnover, concentrated specifically among employees hired in roles that would have required completing the service animal training within their first 30 days, several of whom had left the company, according to exit interview notes on file. Citing frustration with management practices that didn't align with what they understood the company's actual values to be. He's been running his own shop, Colton said out loud, the pieces settling into a shape that made the cold thing in high. As chest sharpened into something closer to focused anger, the specific, controlled anger he recognized from years of assessing threats methodically rather than reacting to them emotionally. Mans had free reign at that property for 6 years, and either corporate oversight completely missed it, or somebody looked the other way because his profit numbers looked fine on paper. He spent another hour that morning simply sitting with the numbers, the way he'd once spent hours studying satellite imagery of a compound before a mission, looking for the pattern underneath the pattern. What struck him most, reading back through the 18 months of dismissed complaints, wasn't the volume. 7 complaints across a year and a half was, in the grand scheme of a 200-property company processing hundreds of thousands of guest stays annually, a number small enough to get lost in the noise if nobody was looking closely. What struck him was the language. Every single resolution note, regardless of which corporate representative had handled the initial complaint intake, used strikingly similar phrasing: isolated incident, staff has been reminded of policy, guest has been offered a complimentary future stay as a gesture of goodwill, boilerplate so consistent across 18 months and multiple different intake staff that it suggested, to Colton's trained eye. Not a series of individually investigated incidents, but a template response applied without any actual follow-through, the customer service equivalent of a unit filing the same incomplete after-action report 7 times running because nobody up the chain ever asked hard enough questions to force a real one. He called Priya back within the hour, and this time his voice carried none of the careful restraint from the night before. "I want the regional operations director on a call by 9, he said. "I want to understand how a property can run a completion rate under 40% on mandatory training for 6 straight years without a single flag getting raised through normal channels. And I want everything you can find connecting Krantz's hiring and firing patterns to that training gap, because right now this doesn't look like negligence to me, Priya. This looks like a man who knew exactly what the policy was and decided, deliberately, over and over, not to follow it, and either fired or drove out anyone on his staff who might have pushed back." "I'll set it up," Priya said. "Colton, what do you want to do about last night specifically? Krantz doesn't know who he was talking to." Colton looked over at Diesel, who had lifted his head at the change in tension in Colton's voice, and was watching him now with the same steady, assessing patience he'd shown at the front desk the night before, unbothered, waiting. "I want to go back," Colton said, "today, in person, and I want to see exactly how he handles it when he finds out." He drove back to the Barrow Falls property a little after 2 that afternoon, Diesel riding in the back seat in his usual loose, trusting sprawl, and parked in the same lot he'd parked in the evening before, walking back into the same lobby with the same easy, practiced heel from Diesel at his side. The desk was staffed by a different employee this time, an older man whose name tag read Gene, and Colton asked, politely, whether Doyle Krantz happened to be on the property that afternoon. "He's in the back office," Gene said. "Want me to grab him?" "Please," Colton said, and waited, one hand resting on Diesel's head, watching the lobby with the same careful, patient attention he'd once used to scan a room before a breach, though nothing about this particular room presented any physical danger, just the slower, more complicated danger of a confrontation he'd been turning over in his mind since the previous evening. Doyle Krantz emerged from the back office a moment later, a stocky man in his late 40s with the particular self-satisfied bearing of someone who'd spent years running his own small kingdom without much outside interference, and his expression, when he recognized Colton from the previous night's phone call, recognized his face, presumably, from some employee ID photo database, or simply from the memory of a difficult guest, shifted immediately into irritation. "You're back," Krantz said, not bothering to hide his displeasure. "I told you last night, we don't allow." "Mr. Krantz," Colton said, cutting him off, his voice carrying a quiet, unhurried authority that made Krantz pause mid-sentence despite himself. "I want to introduce myself properly this time. My name is Colton Reyes. I'm the founder and chief executive officer of Meridian Point Hospitality." The color drained visibly from Doyle Krantz's face, a physical transformation Colton had seen before, a handful of times over the years, in exactly this kind of moment, and he watched it happen now with a detached, clinical patience, waiting to see what the man would do with the information now that it had landed. Krantz started and stopped, visibly recalculating, his eyes flicking toward Gene at the front desk and then back to Colton, then down to Diesel, sitting calm and steady at Colton's side, as if seeing the dog for the first time with genuinely fresh eyes. "Mr. Reyes, there's clearly been some kind of misunderstanding. I didn't realize. You told me on the phone last night that you personally implemented a no-pets policy at this property that overrides written corporate policy," Colton said, his voice still level, still unhurried, carrying none of the emotional heat that Krantz's own voice had rapidly acquired. "You told me you've run it that way for 6 years. You told me when I said I'd file a complaint that it wouldn't change anything on your end. I'm not here about a misunderstanding, Mr. Krantz. I'm here because I want to understand exactly how deep this goes." He laid it out for Krantz there in the lobby, plainly, the way he'd have delivered a briefing to any subordinate under any circumstances. The 7 documented complaints over 18 months, the training completion rate sitting under 40%, the pattern of staff departures that suggested a deliberate culture at odds with the company's actual values. All of it assembled by Priya's overnight work and laid out now with the same methodical precision Colton had once used assessing a compound before deciding how to move through it. Krantz's face went through several stages during the recitation: shock, then something like calculation, then, finally, a kind of resigned defensiveness that told Colton everything he needed to know about whether this had been an accident or a pattern. "Look," Krantz said, his voice lower now, more careful. "I run a clean property. Numbers are good. Occupancy's up. Damage claims are down. I made a judgment call a few years back that dogs create more problems than they solve, and maybe I should have run that up the chain before I made it standing policy, but I didn't think it'd cause this kind of. You didn't think a man wearing a Purple Heart pin on his jacket, standing in front of you with a certified service animal, wearing a harness that says service animal in letters 4 inches tall, deserved a room at a company whose entire founding purpose was making sure that never happened to anybody again, Colton said, and for the first time since walking back into that lobby, something in his voice sharpened into an edge that made Krantz visibly flinch. That's not a judgment call, Mr. Krantz. That's a decision to override a policy you were trained on, that you signed acknowledgement of in your own employee file, because you personally decided you knew better. He let that sit in the air for a moment, the lobby gone entirely silent except for the low hum of the ice machine somewhere down the hallway, before continuing, his voice returning to its earlier, controlled evenness. I want to be very clear about something. This isn't just about last night. I've asked our HR director to open a full review of this property's operations under your management, training compliance, complaint handling, hiring and termination patterns going back the full 6 years of your tenure here. If what I'm seeing in the preliminary numbers holds up, and I have no reason right now to think it won't, this is going to result in termination, and depending on what the ADA compliance review turns up, it may result in more than that. Krantz opened his mouth, closed it again, and finally said, in a voice that had lost most of its earlier bluster, "What do you want me to do right now?" "Right now," Colton said, "I want you to think very carefully about every guest you've turned away over the past 6 years because of a policy you invented, and I want you to understand that every single one of them deserved better than what you gave them. That's not something I can fix with a phone call. But I can make sure it stops happening at this property, and I can make sure it's not happening quietly at any other property in this company without somebody catching it a lot sooner than we caught this one." He turned to Jean, who had been standing frozen behind the front desk through the entire exchange, clearly unsure whether he was watching a firing in real time or something even larger. "Jean, is it?" Colton asked, his voice softening considerably. "I'd like to check in tonight if you're able to help me with that." Jean, recovering himself with visible effort, nodded quickly. "Yes, sir, absolutely, right this way, right here, let me just." He fumbled with the keyboard for a moment before producing a room key, sliding it across the counter with the particular careful respect of a man who had just watched the ground shift dramatically beneath his feet and wanted very badly to be on the right side of whatever came next. "No charge for the room tonight, sir, and no charge for diesel, is it?" "Beautiful. Dog." "Thank you, Jean," Colton said, and meant it, recognizing in the young man's flustered but genuine courtesy exactly the kind of instinct the company's training was supposed to build into every single employee, an instinct Jean had apparently arrived with on his own, without needing a CEO's identity revealed to prompt it. He didn't fire Doyle Krantz on the spot that afternoon, though every instinct in him wanted to, because 2 decades of building a company the right way had taught him that even the most deserved consequences needed to move through proper process, needed documentation and due diligence behind them, both for the sake of the company's legal standing and in some smaller, more personal way, for Colton's own sense of running things fairly even when fairness felt, in the moment, like an unwelcome delay. He told Krantz he'd be hearing from HR within the week, and he meant it as both a warning and a genuine promise of process, and then he took his key and diesel and went to find his room. That evening, before he'd even unpacked the small bag he traveled with, Colton found himself back down in the lobby, drawn there less by any particular purpose than by a restlessness that hadn't settled since the confrontation earlier that afternoon. Jean was still on shift, and the young man, catching sight of Colton crossing the lobby with Diesel at his heel, straightened visibly behind the counter with the particular nervous energy of someone still recalibrating how to behave around a person whose actual position in the company he'd only just learned. "Can I get you anything, Mr. Reyes?" Jean asked. "Coffee's fresh in the breakfast area, though I know that's not much this time of evening." "I'm all right," Colton said, and then, because something in Jean's earlier instinct with Diesel that afternoon had stuck with him, added, "Mind if I ask you something? You've worked here how long?" "Going on 2 years," Jean said. "Started part-time while I was finishing up some classes at the community college, stuck around full-time after." "You ever complete that service animal training module, the real one, not just clicking through it?" Jean's expression shifted, something careful entering it. Did the training when I onboarded, yes, sir. Mr. Krantz never seemed real interested in it being followed close, if I'm honest. Told a couple of us early on that he had his own way of handling the front desk and we should just go with it. I always figured, he hesitated, glancing down at Diesel. I always figured it wasn't really my place to argue with the GM, but it never sat right, turning folks away like that. My uncle served 2 tours, and I know what it does to a man, coming home and still getting treated like an inconvenience somewhere down the line. Colton studied him for a moment, something in the young man's plain, unguarded honesty settling a small piece of the tension that had been sitting in his chest since the previous evening. That instinct you had, this afternoon, crouching down and letting him sniff your hand before you reached for him, where'd that come from? Jean shrugged, a little embarrassed. Grew up around dogs. Guess it just seemed like the decent way to greet one, especially one wearing a vest that says he's working. That's exactly right, Colton said. That's the whole training program in one sentence, if you want to know the truth. Everything else is just details. He made a note to himself that night, sitting alone in his room with Diesel stretched across the foot of the bed, to ask Priya about Jean's file specifically, a small thread he intended to follow regardless of how the larger investigation eventually resolved. The investigation that followed over the next 3 weeks confirmed nearly everything the preliminary numbers had suggested, and added layers Colton hadn't anticipated. Priya's team, working with the company's legal counsel, uncovered that Krantz hadn't simply been ignoring policy out of personal preference. He'd been quietly steering a portion of the property's discretionary spending toward a side arrangement with a regional pest control and cleaning contractor owned by his brother-in-law, billing the company for services at rates well above market. A scheme that had apparently flourished specifically because Krantz's 6 years of unchallenged authority at the property had allowed him to avoid the kind of close financial scrutiny that might otherwise have caught it sooner. The no pets policy, it turned out during the investigation, wasn't purely a personal preference about liability at all. It had in part been a convenient pretext for keeping occupancy artificially selective in a way that let Krantz manipulate certain financial metrics tied to his own performance bonus structure, a detail that took the forensic accounting team the better part of 2 weeks to fully untangle. The regional operations director, a man named Philip Sautel, who'd overseen the Barrow Falls Pro. Purdy throughout Krantz's entire tenure and had signed off on 6 consecutive years of quarterly reviews without ever flagging the training compliance gap, was placed on administrative leave pending his own review, a development that led Colton to institute, over the following months, a company-wide audit of training compliance verification across every single property in the Meridian Point portfolio, a process that would eventually catch 2 smaller, less severe versions of the same pattern at other locations and correct them before they metastasized into anything approaching what had happened in Barrow Falls. Krantz was terminated for cause 3 weeks after Colton's visit, the financial misconduct findings giving the company more than sufficient grounds beyond the policy violations alone, and though Colton felt no particular satisfaction in the termination itself, it was, in the end, simply the correct and necessary conclusion to a situation that should never have been allowed to develop in the first place. He did feel something closer to relief when Priya called to confirm it. A sense of a wound finally being properly claimed rather than simply covered over. Colton didn't stop at Barrow Falls, though. In the weeks that followed, he authorized a substantial expansion of the company's veteran and service animal training program, working directly with Priya and a small team to redesign the mandatory module from the ground up, adding real accountability measures this time, quarterly, unannounced compliance checks at every property, a direct hotline routed to Priya's office specifically for veteran and service animal complaints. Bypassing the standard customer service queue entirely so nothing could get quietly filed away with a form letter apology ever again, and a new policy requiring every general manager across all 200 properties to personally complete an in-person refresher training annually, delivered, at Colton's own insistence, by veterans the company partnered with specifically for that purpose, men and women who could speak to the policy's importance from lived experience rather than from a slide deck. He also did something that surprised even Priya, who thought by that point she understood the full range of what Colton was likely to do in response to what had happened. He reached out, personally, to each of the 7 guests whose complaints had been logged and dismissed over the preceding 18 months, tracking down contact information through the company's records, and called every single one of them himself. The calls were uncomfortable, some of them deeply so. One veteran, a woman named Marisol Ibarra, who'd been traveling with a service dog trained to manage her own combat-related PTSD, had been so humiliated by her treatment at the Barrow Falls property the previous spring that she'd sworn off the entire Meridian Point chain and told Colton plainly that she didn't much care what the CEO had to say about it now, months after the fact. When the damage to her evening and her sense of safety on the road had already been done. Colton didn't argue with her. He listened, apologized without qualification or excuse, and told her honestly what the company was doing in response: the termination, the audit, the new hotline, the retraining, not as an attempt to earn her forgiveness, which he told her plainly wasn't owed to him, but simply because she deserved to know that what happened to her had mattered enough to change something real. "I appreciate you calling," she said, near the end of that conversation, her voice still carrying an edge but softer than it had been at the start. "Most companies don't bother, they just let it go quiet." "I built this company so that wouldn't happen to people like you," Colton said. "I failed at that, at least at one property, for longer than I'm comfortable admitting. Calling you doesn't fix what already happened, but I wanted you to hear it directly, not through a form letter." She didn't come back to Meridian Point, not that year, and Colton didn't push her to. But 4 of the other 6 guests he called did return, eventually, some of them specifically requesting the Barrow Falls property, now under new management, as if testing whether the change was real, and each time, according to the reports that filtered back to Colton through Priya's office, the experience matched what the company's actual policy had always promised, 6 years too late for some of them, but real nonetheless. The story found its way into local news within a few weeks. A reporter for a regional outlet picked up on the termination and the subsequent training overhaul through a source inside the company, and the resulting article headlined something about a hotel chain's CEO personally uncovering discrimination at his own property, generated enough attention that Colton found himself, briefly and uncomfortably, fielding interview requests he mostly declined, preferring to let the policy changes speak for themselves rather than turning the story into a personal narrative about his own good intentions. He gave one interview, eventually, to a small Veterans Affairs publication, specifically because the editor who reached out had served to tour herself and asked questions that felt less like a media opportunity and more like a genuine conversation between people who understood the same particular weight. And in that interview, when asked why he'd built the company's founding policy around veterans and service animals in the first place, Colton had answered simply, without much elaboration, that he remembered what it felt like to be turned away, and he'd never wanted anybody else to feel that particular kind of tired, specific humiliation if he had any power at all to prevent it. The story found its way into local news within a few weeks. A reporter for a regional outlet picked up on the termination and the subsequent training overhaul through a source inside the company, and the resulting article headlined something about a hotel chain's CEO personally uncovering discrimination at his own property, generated enough attention that Colton found himself, briefly and uncomfortably, fielding interview requests he mostly declined, preferring to let the policy changes speak for themselves rather than turning the story into a personal narrative about his own good intentions. He gave one interview, eventually, to a small Veterans Affairs publication, specifically because the editor who reached out had served to tour herself and asked questions that felt less like a media opportunity and more like a genuine conversation between people who understood the same particular weight. And in that interview, when asked why he'd built the company's founding policy around veterans and service animals in the first place, Colton had answered simply, without much elaboration, that he remembered what it felt like to be turned away, and he'd never wanted anybody else to feel that particular kind of tired, specific humiliation if he had any power at all to prevent it. The board of directors, when the full scope of the situation was finally presented to them in a formal quarterly session, had mixed reactions, and Colton sat through that meeting with the same patient, unhurried composure he'd carried through the entire ordeal, listening to one board member, a numbers-focused investor named Kurt Halloran, who joined the board during the company's expansion into its 9th state, question whether the personal outreach to all 7 affected guests and the public nature of the eventual news coverage represented an unnecessary liability exposure that a more cautious, quieter internal resolution might have avoided. "I understand the concern," Colton told him. in a tone that gave nothing away of the irritation the question stirred in him. But I didn't build this company to manage liability exposure at the expense of doing right by the people it was built to serve. If protecting the company's reputation ever requires me to handle a betrayal of its founding values quietly, so nobody outside this room finds out how badly we failed somebody, then we've already lost the thing that makes this company worth protecting in the first place. The room went quiet for a moment after that, and though Halloran didn't fully concede the point, the board's eventual vote to formally ratify the expanded training and compliance program passed without further serious objection, and Colton left that meeting with the particular tired satisfaction of a man who'd said something true and watched it land, even if it hadn't landed everywhere equally. By late November, the story had mostly faded from local news cycles, replaced by whatever new development had captured the region's attention, and Colton found himself, on a cold, clear evening a few days before Thanksgiving, back at the Barrow Falls property under his own name this time, no alias, no incognito check-in, simply visiting to see the new manager's operation firsthand and to check, personally, on how the retraining had actually landed with the staff who remained. Jean was still working the front desk, promoted, Colton learned, to assistant manager under the property's new leadership, and he greeted Colton with the particular warmth of someone who'd watched an organization respond to failure the right way and had come out the other side of that experience with more faith in the company rather than less. "Diesel doing all right?" Jean asked, coming around the counter to crouch down and offer the back of his hand for the old dog to sniff, a small, correct gesture that Colton noted with quiet satisfaction. Exactly the kind of instinct the retraining was meant to instill, and exactly the instinct Jean had already possessed on his own, months earlier, before anyone had told him it mattered. "Slowing down some," Colton said, watching Diesel accept Jean's greeting with the same calm. Patience he extended to most things. Getting old, still does his job better than most people, twice his energy, though. He stayed only a short while that evening, long enough to walk the property, speak briefly with a few staff members about how the new training modules felt in practice, and confirm, through both the numbers Priya had pulled and his own direct observation, that whatever had gone wrong under Doyle Krantz's 6 years of quiet authority had been genuinely, structurally addressed rather than simply patched over for appearances. He didn't stay the night. He drove home instead, the 2.5 hours back toward the company's headquarters, Diesel stretched across the back seat in his familiar loose sprawl, the highway unspooling dark and quiet ahead of the truck's headlights, and somewhere around the halfway point of that drive, Colton found himself thinking, not for the first time since that October evening, about the particular strange justice of the whole situation, that it had taken his own dog being turned away at his own hotel. An indignity he could have avoided entirely simply by identifying himself the moment Brittany asked for documentation, to uncover a pattern that had likely cost 7 other veterans and their service animals real, lasting humiliation before anyone with the power to fix it noticed. "Wasn't an accident you being there that night," he said out loud, glancing at Diesel in the rearview mirror, the dog's ears flicking toward the sound of his voice even in sleep. Or maybe it was. Maybe it's just that when you go looking with your eyes open, sooner or later you find the thing that needs finding. Either way, good thing you were there. Good thing it was us that walked into that lobby and not somebody without the standing to make them listen. He thought, too, about the money the whole episode could theoretically have cost him, had he chosen to pursue Krantz through a public lawsuit rather than a quiet, thorough internal process. The settlement figures his legal team had floated as hypothetically available given the 8 of violations on record, numbers substantial enough that a different kind of man might have seen the entire episode as an unexpected windfall rather than an organizational wound to be healed. Colton had never once considered that route seriously. The money had never been the point, not in building the company originally, and not in cleaning up this particular failure within it. The point, the whole point, had always been simpler than that a tired man and his dog, walking into any Meridian Point lobby anywhere in 11 states on any night of the year, should never again be told they weren't welcome. He pulled into his own driveway a little before 10 that night, the house dark except for the porch light he always left on, and let Diesel out of the back seat, watching the old dog stretch stiffly on the cold driveway before following him inside, the two of them moving through the quiet house with the easy, wordless familiarity of 9 years' partnership, and Colton stood for a moment in his own kitchen, pouring a glass of water, looking down at Diesel settling into his bed by the door with a low Contented groan, and felt something in his chest finally unclench that had been tight since the moment Brittany had looked at his dog and decided, without any real basis, that they weren't welcome. "We did all right," he told the dog, quiet, the same words he found himself saying more often than he probably realized, at the end of most days that mattered. "We did all right, old man." Diesel didn't lift his head, already drifting toward sleep, but his tail thumped once against the floor, slow and certain, and Colton took that, the way he always did, as agreement enough. If this story reminded you why it matters to stand up for the people who have already given so much, take a moment and hit that like button before you go. It genuinely helps stories like this one find the people who need to see them. Subscribe if you want more stories about veterans, loyalty, and the quiet ways justice sometimes finds its way home. Drop a comment and tell me what part of this one stayed with you. And if you know someone who'd appreciate a story about a good dog and a debt finally paid, go ahead and share this with them. Thank you for staying with us to the very end. We'll see you in the next one.